Okay, we'll get started. I'm delighted to welcome you today to the third talk in our series on new technologies and human body. Today we have Kieran O'Doherty speaking on Biobanks, Personalised Medicine, and Social Justice. And yes, please join me in welcoming him to our series.
Thanks very much, Monique. Okay, so I'll jump straight into it. The work that I'm talking about today is collaborative work with a number of different people, mainly Mike Burgess at UBC, but also a number of other international collaborators, and I'll mention that where that becomes relevant in the talk. There's sort of two main parts to what I'll be doing today. The first is to talk just about biobanks, what they are, and a lot of the social and ethical challenges surrounding them. And in the second part of the talk, I'll speak more directly towards this research program about involving publics in defining the ethical norms and also possibly involving them in governance structures surrounding biobanks. I just want to quickly get a quick gauge. How many people would have heard of biobanks before? So almost everyone, yeah. And who would say that they're reasonably familiar with? Kind of, okay, so that's good. This is very different from my third year class. Okay, so I'll go very quickly over these preliminary slides, given that most people are very aware of this. So human tissue biobanking, we're talking really about any kind of large collection of human tissues. It can be different kinds of tissues, so it could be blood, could be tumors, really any number of things. And also these collections exist for different purposes. I'm going to be talking primarily about health research purposes today. Some collections are very old, have been around for a long time. And some collections are now being collected prospectively, mainly for population research purposes. And the implications for the different types of biobanks in some circumstances are similar, but sometimes are quite different. And I'll try and go into that in a little bit of detail as well. So this is a slide that I think almost everyone who does a talk on biobanks puts up there. In 2009, Time magazine had their annual 10 biggest ideas sort of feature, and biobanks was number 8. And so this was picked up by the NIH and, of course, many other people. So there is a lot of hype around biobanks in the biomedical research sort of fora, and I'll explain why that is the case. The interesting thing is, however, and this audience is very unusual, it's not just my third year classes. In most forums, when I do talk about biobanks, most people haven't heard about biobanks. And it is kind of ironic, given that in the biomedical researchers sort of talk so much about the hype, and bioethicists love talking about the hype around biobanks. But in a larger sort of public forum, most people haven't heard about this, and that is significant when we ask questions around how do we involve publics in the governance or defining of ethical norms for biobanks. Okay, so what's supposed to be so good about these biobanks? Essentially, they're seen as shortcuts to medical discovery. So the idea is that if you have a large collection of human tissues, you can use them not just for a single study, but for many different studies on an ongoing basis. And you're also able to pool resources, financial and otherwise, for a particular biobank so that you can just get much larger numbers of tissue samples than you would with individual studies. So the specific kind of things that people are looking for are genetic markers for diagnostic tests. And this is for predisposition testing for various kind of cancers, for example. But then what seems to be holding a lot of promise is pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics, where the goal is to pinpoint the effectiveness on drugs based on genotype. So we know with many drugs, the actual effectiveness rate is relatively small, even for very good drugs. So there's all these people where the drug has no effect, and then a small number of people where the drug actually has adverse effects. If we knew that ahead of time, that would, of course, be very good from a patient care perspective and also from an economical perspective. And then finally, it's not only about genetics. Biobanks can also be used to pinpoint environmental toxins, for example. So a lot of the hype around biobanks is geared towards this larger, very vague idea of personalized medicine, which tends to be geared towards genomic medicine, of course. And I've heard that GPs and family physicians are always quite upset when they hear about this move towards personalized medicine. They said this is what we've been doing for decades. But of course, the meaning is slightly different here. So the idea is that based on these very fancy molecular tests, we can tailor treatment, and biobanks are seen as a very important tool in getting towards that knowledge. So I'll go into a little bit more detail now about the different types of biobanks. And of course, I'm less interested in the biomedical aspects, but of course the sort of social and ethical implications. So I'll start pointing out some of these things here. So one type of biobank is associated with hospital pathology collections. So these are path labs that have all of these human tissues coming out of the regular operations of clinical care that get kept for, usually in the first instance, clinical reasons, but then they just get kept. And so a question that arises for many of these collections is, well, why not use them for research? And in many instances, this has happened, where researchers then get access to these pathology collections to do whatever study they want to do on them. And many pathologists have gotten quite nervous about the idea that, well, there's never been any consent around this. And so in BC, one of the projects that we were working with, Peter Watson is a pathologist and who runs several different tumor repositories and biobanks. And this was one of his main areas of concern is, what happens if, say, there's some big news splash and everyone says, hey, all of your human tissues are being used for all this research. You didn't know about it and you were never asked consent and so on. That would probably be a pretty bad thing to happen, and the repercussions might be quite dramatic. So the issues here are surrounding a collection that exists where there was no real prospective plan for what was going to happen, how the governance was going to be managed, and so on. But it seems to be a good idea to use this for research. And how do you do that? Another kind of collection might be autopsy materials. I don't want to talk about that in a lot of detail. Newborn blood spots is very interesting. So this is another kind of biobank where, so part of newborn screening, the Guthrie cards get filled out with blood spots. Some of them get used for the actual newborn screening process, but blood is left over, and that just then gets kept. And different jurisdictions have different rules around how long you can keep these things and what you can use them for or not. But in many, many jurisdictions, they are used for health research. And in some jurisdictions, they have even been used for other things. And of course, without consent. Because newborn screening is done without consent, there is no consent process then for what you do with those blood spots. In a couple of cases just recently, in Texas and in Minnesota, there was big outcry. So Texas is the really well-covered one. There were some sort of parent advocates who really got quite incensed about this, and you might have seen sort of pictures in the news about babies with little onesies that said that the government has my DNA and things like that. So a very well coordinated campaign along sort of privacy rights that eventually led to the destruction of several million of those samples. So, of course, those parent organizations saw this as a great success. The research community saw this as a great failure and loss of a very, very valuable resource. There has been some analysis on this, and some people have sort of pointed out that those people advocating probably were not actually very representative of parents more broadly. There were just a small number of people who had an axe to grind, but that in a way is by the by, because the fact is this is what it led to. Okay, so then So these are all ongoing issues, but the one type of biobank that is probably the most important, I think, in terms of this personalized medicine and ongoing research is these population biobanks. And these are really a somewhat of a new phenomenon. In some ways, they're similar to just very large cohort studies, but of course, there is this banking of tissues alongside the cohort study kind of setup. So we have here the idea that we're not just looking for at say cancer patients like you would have for a cancer tumor repository, but rather you're looking at very large samples from the healthy population, and of course some of those individuals will develop illnesses, and then you have this natural experiment set up and this natural stratification. In one of the most famous population biobanks would probably be UK Biobank. It's probably also one of the largest ones. So they aimed and recently achieved 500,000 participants across the country. In Canada, we've got several population biobank projects. We've got the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, based out of McMaster, Dalhousie, and McGill. We have a federated model that, also for a different biobank project called the Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow project. But it's really a lot of independent biobank cohort studies run in the different provinces. So these kinds of biobanks are set up prospectively with the intention of conducting research. So we're talking about something very different from those path collections. So here, there's usually a lot of careful engagement with research ethics protocols, how to involve participants, and a lot of the ethical challenges that I'll talk through in a moment are probably best worked out for these population biobanks. So there are, of course, other kinds of biobanks, sort of food-related seed banks and so on. Then just recently, based on human microbiome research, so the microbes associated with the healthy human body, we've got some microbial biobanks starting. There's animal DNA biobanks and so on. I'm not going to be talking about any of those. That's just to acknowledge, of course, these things exist. Now, I'm talking primarily about health research, and that's what the focus of this talk is going to be. But I do also want to mention that some of the concerns that I feel have not gotten enough attention in the literature so far, and some of us are trying to push this a little bit further, is once you build these biobanks, and I'm talking specifically about the population biobanks, of course, you really, in a way, lose control of what you've created. So we build buildings in society all the time for a specific purpose, but we have no idea what 50 years, 100 years down the line these things are going to be used for. And there are specific areas, of course, where we do have concern about what these biobanks might be used for. And these are primarily things like forensic uses, and probably most concerning are rolling these data banks into terrorist surveillance kind of systems and so on. And when you speak to health researchers about this, they say, well, that's not why we're building them. And it's very difficult to get past, yes, we understand that that's not why you're building them. But there's no way that you can guarantee that the government will not step in and do this. And this, of course, is much more of a concern in the US in many ways, for a bunch of reasons that I don't want to get into. Okay, so we now have these biobanks, and what really are the societal and ethical challenges specifically with these things? And that's what I'm going to now talk about for a little while, to make the kind of the social science and humanities aspects of this really, really obvious. There's a bunch of different aspects to this. One is just a very straightforward research ethics problem, or a set of research ethics problems. So this is from the perspective of research ethics governance. How do you actually do this? So this is informed consent, privacy, and so on. So those are, and we'll talk through that. The key challenge here is that research ethics protocols were set up for individual studies in which patients are enrolled, or patients or participants are enrolled, and for human subject protection of those participants. But because biobanks don't really follow that mold, existing protocols don't work very well. And so we'll talk through that. Then a second big issue is it's also now become part of research ethics, and it's recognized in the TCPS2 around identifiable communities, their involvement in research and their involvement in biobanks. But it's a little bit different from I think, traditional research ethics because it's no longer necessarily just about individual subject protection. There's a few other things going on there. And then I want to talk a little bit about sort of broader societal challenges that are really not captured at all in research ethics. These are just broader things, more to do with social justice issues and some sort of political theory questions. Okay, so on the research ethics side, a few people got together quite early on, Elaine Gibson at Dalhousie and Don Willis in the Public Health Organization, and they did some studies around how research ethics boards across Canada adjudicate applications involving biobanks, and found that a big problem was that there was no consistency at all. And this fits very well with what commentators around the world have pointed out, which is very simply that REB protocols were not designed with these kind of things in mind. And some have gone further and made fairly strong claims about the fact that existing human subject protection, number one, actually inhibits the effect of operation on the biobanks. And by doing that, it actually doesn't even provide proper protection anyway. So it's failing on both ends. And so the upshot of all of this is that there's a broad recognition that we need to find other ways of doing ethics oversight for biobanks. So what are the problems? So the big one that gets discussed everywhere is informed consent. In a standard typical research study, you enroll participants, you tell them exactly what it's about that they're going to get involved in, what the risks are, what the benefits are, and people can then decide. But a key point is also that you tell them about what the research is all about. So how do you do that with a biobank where you're enrolling people for future projects that can't be envisaged? So how do you actually meaningfully do this in the way that we have traditionally seen informed consent? So there's a lot of argument about, is it okay to have broad consent? Other people say, informed consent doesn't mean that you have to know about what the study's all about. So there's all sorts of arguments going on here, but nobody's really kind of reached a kind of a position that we can broadly agree to. So the strict interpretation of informed consent would mean that every study you do using the biobank, you'd have to recontact every single person and reconsent them for the project. That is, of course, very expensive. It's also probably would lead to a lot of dropouts, and it kind of also defeats the purpose of the biobank in the first place, which is to collect and enroll individuals so that you don't have to do this every time. Then there's also issues around withdrawal of consent. So we had very long conversations with the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, who guarantee, as every other researcher does, that if you withdraw your consent, that's okay, you can pull out. And then they realized when they worked through the implications that it actually wasn't possible, and that there was a very interesting paradox, and that is if they actually... Now, the sample destruction is the easier part, and even that's not straightforward. But the data destruction is the complicated part. Because there's regular backups of the whole database, if you actually destroy somebody's data and their presence in the database, that actually makes them identifiable because you can notice the difference between the present and the backup. So even with the best of intentions, informed consent protocols are very, very difficult to implement in these kind of setups. Okay, another big area of concern is that of privacy. This is also a very standard kind of research ethics concern. Because biobanks, number one, are designed for longevity. They're supposed to be around for a long time. That automatically increases the risks of privacy infringement. And then on top of that, there's also a mandated data sharing component with biobanks. Because you're supposed to be a research platform, you're supposed to make this platform and this research available to as many researchers as possible. So, of course, that is in conflict with privacy goals. What are the concerns around privacy infringements? Well, the main ones are around denial of healthcare and health insurance. And then, of course, there are more sort of sinister things of hacking in and using the information for identity theft and all sorts of other things that you might sort of imagine here. Now, over the years, there's been sort of certain key papers that have really pushed the envelope on this whole privacy protection. So I've only just highlighted one here. There was a time before before 2008, where it was seen as a sufficient standard to have these databases aggregated and anonymized in such a way that you could actually then make them publicly available. So it was deemed that it was not possible to identify an individual in those circumstances. Then Homer et al. Published a paper where they showed that with reference DNA, you were able to identify people in these aggregated, anonymized data sets, and the NIH responded very quickly by taking down these data sets. And this led to, again, lots of discussions about how do we manage this? How do we do this? And people are trying to come up with new sorts of electronic safeguards and so on all the time. Okay, a third one that's also a very typical kind of research ethics problem, bioethics problem, is the return of research results. This is very sexy at the moment. There's a lot of publications coming out on this. And so the question here is, how do you deal with incidental findings that may come out as part of the research process? So somebody does a study on Alzheimer's, and there's different classifications of the type of findings that might come out. So say somebody does a study on Alzheimer's and then finds that you are at heightened risk of Alzheimer's. Do you want that? Does that information get back to you? And another conundrum is, okay, they're doing a study on Alzheimer's, but they find a marker on heart disease. Now that's a different category. Again, do you tell people that? Then there's also a lot of routine tests that get done just by enrollment in a cohort study in Biobank, like, for example, the Canadian longitudinal study on aging. Which of those results do you feed back? Which do you don't? Like, especially if they're kind of cognitive decline type measures, do you pass them on and not? So once again, nobody has a really good answer to this. There is starting to be a kind of a drift towards an imperative to inform people. Whereas before it was the opposite. So for a long time it was more a case of these are not clinical tests. So we should not use them to infer clinical kind of outcomes. But now it seems to be going more in the opposite direction of researchers do have some sort of duty here, and people are now scrambling. Well, if there's a duty, how the heck do you build that into studies that are not designed to do clinical care? This whole return of results also interacts with these privacy considerations, because the more you anonymize, then of course you can't do this return of research results. So how do you deal with that? And the poor researchers are of course have their heads in their hands. Okay, so a problem with all of these ethical challenges is not only that you have problems of how do you enact these ethical principles in this kind of work. You have the added challenge then that there's ethical value trade-offs. And so there's a bunch of these, but I think the most obvious one is this privacy versus research facilitation. The whole idea of biobanks is to facilitate health research. And health research is generally seen as a societal good because it leads to more treatments and so on and so on. Now, of course, there's disagreement, but as a recognizable societal value. On the other hand, privacy is also a very recognizable societal value, but the more you facilitate research, the more you threaten privacy. The more you protect privacy, the more you inhibit the research process. So the question here is, where do we draw that line? And where I'm going to go later in this presentation is to say that there is no expert opinion anywhere in the world that will give a conclusive answer to this. And so the argument that a number of us have made is that there is some democratic imperative to open this question up to wider societal discourse and broader consideration before actually making those trade-offs, before drawing the line anyway on that spectrum. Okay, so moving a little bit beyond just the narrow research ethics issues, there's questions of involving collectives or identifiable communities. So in Canada, this is most notably First Nations, but of course there are many other identifiable communities, in particular also disease communities, which is very important in this context. And the question is, how do we deal with individual consent versus community consent, and CHR has started to develop better guidelines on this. But we have a couple of recent cases where there have been sort of very significant breaches in trust. In Arizona, the Havasupai tribe was, I think, a few years ago, where technically, according to the informed consent documents, the researchers didn't transgress at all. But in terms of the expectations of the tribe, they did transgress, and it led to court cases and all sorts of problems, and essentially in a breakdown of trust in the relationship between the university and the tribe. In Canada, we've got the case of the Nucha North tribe on Vancouver Island, where a genetics researcher, went to the tribe, collected blood samples to do health-related research. Now, he didn't find anything, but he was no longer in contact with the tribe, actually left Canada, moved to the UK, continued to do research on the samples, but his own research took a different direction, so he started doing genealogical type of research and so on. The tribe never knew about this. The researcher actually died. The wife found these samples, didn't know what to do with them, contacted the tribe and said, hey, do you guys want this back? They said, what? What's going on? And this has led to all sorts of problems as well. And again, to very significant breaches and breakdown of trust relationships. Now, a very interesting question is that of ownership. So on an individual level, we can ask, once tissue has been removed from your body, who owns it? And now, in the past, it might have been considered waste, certain things, certainly like a tumor removal or something like that. Blood has always been a special kind of category of the idea of blood donation and so on. But now that we're doing DNA-based research, and there's value in the kind of the genetic material, it raises a very new question. And lawyers, of course, are very interested in sort of commercial rights and so on, and there's lots of court cases on that. And those, in the US in particular, those court cases tend to favor the developer, not the person, not the source of the tissue. But it's not just this has not just implications for the individual, it also has implications for the family, of course, because DNA is shared to a large degree. And a very compelling case was written up in the case of Henrietta Lacks, the book by Rebecca Skloot recently. A lot of people are nodding. If you haven't read it, it's a great read. It's the story of sort of a African American woman from a very poor background, who goes in for a medical test. Turns out she has cancer, and she actually dies as part of that visit. But cells from the tumor are taken and are used by a researcher in the hospital to produce the first immortal cell line. And so the tissue so these cells have grown and grown and multiplied, been used across the world in labs, been sent into outer space, been used for radiation testing, and have been really integral to all sorts of medical breakthroughs over decades now. And the family never knew. And when the widower was told many years later about some of this, he said, "What? She's still alive?" And all these like really horrible instances, like all this miscommunication going on, and then of course also it raises all these social justice issues. We've had all these benefits in society from these cells, and her children and grandchildren are really can't even afford healthcare, and it raises these. So even though it's difficult to point to anyone doing something specifically unethical or specific wrong, it's just full of these things that make you cringe and make you feel that there's something wrong here. So we really don't know how to deal with this question of ownership at all on an individual level. What makes it more complicated in the case of biobanks is that there's a collective resource. And David Winikoff at Berkeley argues that even though each individual donor to a biobank really doesn't have much of a claim to the capital of the biobank, collectively, all the donors together have a huge claim because those samples are the biological capital of the biobank, which enables it to do what it does. And so he's argued for all sorts of governance structures that take this collective ownership into account. Another sort of area around ownership, which has sort of strong social justice overtones, has to do with the fact that much of the research going on utilizing biobanks is directed by and in the interests of the wealthy nations. But increasingly, biobanks are being established using diverse communities from all around the world, and in fact that's necessary for a lot of the research. And so people are starting to say, well, how does that work, right? Like how does the benefit sharing work? How do consent processes work, and so on. And in South Africa, there's been some people advocating for this notion of genomic sovereignty. I have problems with this idea because I think it mixes, natural genetic categories with political categories that doesn't sit very well. But irrespective of that, there are these attempts to kind of equalize the power relationship, at least in some ways, with this research going on. Okay, so I'll finish off with just these last few conundrums before I then move on to the specific research program. So if this wasn't all complicated enough, here are some further problems. A lot of the biobanks, especially the population biobanks, are very large collections, but they're still not large enough to do certain kinds of studies. And so the consortia are forming to attempt to link biobanks across different jurisdictions across countries. This is a regulatory nightmare because we don't even know how to regulate biobanks in our own country. How do you do it across countries? But it also raises other issues. So, for example, I heard this just anecdotally, but that a researcher was talking about procuring biosamples from China, and on the sort of order form, he could tick one of two boxes. One box said consented samples, and the other one was unconsented samples. And the unconsented ones were cheaper, of course. So we're not just dealing with regulatory hurdles, we're dealing with totally different ethical frameworks in which these collections exist. Another complicating factor is that there is there's sort of this growing recognition that biobanks in their role as facilitating this great personalized medicine vision need to be integrated with health records and with care. And so the privacy advocates already have headaches thinking about biobanks. And now, certain people are coming to them and saying, look, we want to do this project where we link the biobank to the health records, and they're just like going, oh my God. We also have a number of areas of breakdown in public trust, some of which I've talked about. And then finally, an issue that as a kind of more of a social science researcher I have is that all of this focus on biobanks, all of this money that's going into it, are there any lost opportunity costs? Because we know that one of the largest determinants of health many of the largest determinants of health are social in nature and not genetic. So who are we really benefiting with all of this personalized genomics, and are we just really emphasizing existing inequalities? So the argument then that a few of us have made is that given all of these conundrums, we really need to involve publics in making decisions about these kind of questions. And there's sort of two somewhat separate strands of work. On the one hand, there's work around direct involvement of governance in governance structures. I've put up a reference that deals with that. I'm not going to talk about that so much today. I'm going to focus more on the second point, which is when we think about what the ethical norms should be that guide the construction of biobanks, their governance, and so on. How do we work towards developing those ethical norms? How do we define them, given all of these ethical value trade-offs and given the uncertainty in terms of existing frameworks and so on? And so, as social scientists, we're of course very good at getting public input. We do surveys, we do focus groups, we do all that sort of stuff. But biobanks is an example where these methods really don't do the trick. So number one, or primarily, all of those social science methods, or pretty much all of them, quantitative and qualitative, rely on the measurement of existing values. So the idea that I would ask a question, what does the public think about this? And then I would do my social science method, and it would say the public thinks X. Now, the problems here there are theoretical issues, so I'll talk about those in the theoretical psychology conference, but I'll focus on the very practical issues, which are nobody knows about biobanks. How can you ask somebody what they think about biobanks if they don't know? And then secondly, even if they did know, the goal here is to formulate like sustainable ethical governance. So say somebody knows about it, but would they appreciate the complexity of the issues? So yes, I want public input, but I don't want a top-of-the-head knee-jerk reaction and formulate long-term policy based on these sorts of things. So the argument then goes towards deliberative democracy and finding meaningful ways of involving publics in these kind of conversations to develop these kind of ethical norms. Just very briefly, there's many different definitions of deliberation and deliberative democracy. John Gastel has a nice short one. He says, when people deliberate, they carefully examine a problem and arrive at a well-reasoned solution after a period of inclusive, respectful consideration of diverse points of view. So the idea here is that you create a very specific communicative event, a very specific kind of situation where you get people together to engage in deliberation. And during that time, they become more informed about the issues. So there's actual technical knowledge that is provided to them. Technical, and I include here ethical issues as well. So over this time, they become more confident in expressing their opinions because they usually come from no knowledge at all to a deeper appreciation. But also, they are exposed to other people's views on these things, other people's values and how those values interact with those kinds of issues. And they're encouraged over this time to take those other values into account, those other opinions into account in the development of their own opinions. At the end of this, you'd see a bunch of different things, but one of the things that you'd hope to see is the development of these genuinely collective group opinions. So very often when we have these large political science surveys, they say, public opinion is, but it's really an aggregate of many individual surveys. This is not so here. Here we're talking about people having actual interaction to lead up to this position. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll come back to some of those issues in just a moment. So the question here is, how do you then operationalize this? How do you actually make this happen? And so this is what we've been trying to do over the last 7 years or so. So Mike Burgess started this project at UBC in around about 2006, and so I got involved in this in 2007, and since then there's been many different projects that have fed into this overall picture. We did 2 big deliberations in British Columbia, one in 2007 and then in 2009. We worked with a collaborator at the Mayo Clinic, Barbara Koenig. She did 2 large deliberations there, 2007, 2008. The Department of Health in Western Australia had an office, still has an office, the Office of Public Health Genomics. They did 2 deliberations, 2008, 2009. Tasmania recently, just last year, did a deliberation to inform biobanking policy in their state. And then the University of California system is building a biobank, and Barbara Koenig is now no longer in the Mayo Clinic. She's now at UC at Davies, I think, and she redeveloped and refined some of the methods to do another deliberation last year as well. Actually, two separate ones. So over the years, based also in part on the fact that there's been different leads on these projects, but also partly in terms of theoretical and methodological refinement, there have been changes to this. That's too much to go into in this talk, but there is a common kind of model that we've sort of stuck with, which is that we do 4 days of deliberation, so usually 2 weekends separated by a weekend in the middle. There's an information provision process at the beginning. Then there's a deliberation process where people are asked to talk about the social and ethical implications in biobanks, and then ideally to work towards reasoned collective positions that then we can ideally again take and to inform biobanking policy. So I'll talk you briefly through some of these steps, and then I'll close off for questions. Recruitment is a complicated thing here. we usually aim for small samples, around about 25 participants. It's a trade-off. Partly it's financial because so James Fishkin, who's well known in sort of deliberative democracy circles, does what he calls a deliberative poll. And he aims for statistical representation of his sample relative to the population. But in British Columbia, that would have meant several hundred participants. So you certainly can't have these meaningful one-on-one conversations. So you're certainly doing something else when you do that. Plus, it would cost several $1 million. So you're starting to get quite prohibitive here. 25 participants is more manageable. So we're running at around about $100,000 per event, excluding salaries. And it actually allows you to have very meaningful conversations, so between small and large groups. So we don't claim statistical representation of those 25 participants, too small, but we do claim demographic stratification and random selection and diversity. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. Then the information provision process, again, is also something very tricky, and probably this is, out of the whole preparation process, this is probably the most time-intensive and resource-intensive. So what we do here is we go through the peer-reviewed literature to source information about biobanks, ethical implications, technical information, all sorts of things. But you can always be charged with being biased, right? Because clearly this is important. Whatever information you provide will, guide the deliberation in certain ways. So how do you deal with this framing issue? And so the way we deal with this is that we try and isolate and identify the range of perspectives that are available on the issue. And then we don't try and find some sort of neutral mishmash between them. We actually present the perspectives themselves so that they're explicit and therefore for the participants to make use of in their deliberations and to think from each of those perspectives. So this booklet, there's been a few different iterations of this, and it's available online. It's a very accessible kind of lay language outline of this is what biobanks are, here are what the ethical challenges are. And this gets sent to participants. Then there's also a website where they can sort of have a few extra things. And then finally, we usually invite around about 5 speakers to these events. And the speakers are also chosen specifically to embody these different perspectives. And when we ask them to speak, we don't ask them to be neutral. We say, you're a biobanker, we want you to tell us why biobanks are good. Then we get a privacy advocate and we get them to say, don't be neutral, tell us what the problems are with biobanks, what are the privacy issues, and so on and so on. And we have one student did an analysis of how these different expert opinions were taken up by the participants, and we found that there was good engagement with that. So they weren't just taken point blank. There was critical engagement with these. People argued them out, contrasted different perspectives against each other, and so on. But that, of course, it's an empirical question rather than you want to check that this is going well rather than assume this. So then the deliberation structure is small and large group discussions, and we've played a little bit with the design in terms of exactly how you set the tasks between small and large groups. But one of the lessons absolutely is that you want to have these things facilitated. You don't want to send people off, and you also want the facilitation to be professional. So as opposed to, say, choosing one of the participants to facilitate themselves, because it puts them in a conflict of interest in terms of being able to express their views. And the facilitation is geared towards people expressing their own views and also developing mutual understanding. And the aim is to work towards consensus, but it's a task aim only. If consensus is not achieved, then the facilitator will try to work out precisely what is the disagreement at what points, and that can stand on its own as a result. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Because if beforehand you knew nothing, now you know, hang on, this is where the hotspot is. This is where the real value difference is. And the assumption is that this would be useful to policymakers as well. So here are just pictures from the 2009 BC BioLibrary deliberation. And this is an image. Oh, no, you can't read this. This is an image of the output as we sort of envisaged it and drove towards for that 2009 deliberation. It hasn't always. There's been different formats as well that we've played with, but the key point I want to get to here is that these are what we would call the deliberative outputs. So these are the collective ratified positions that have been collected and that we can say and that we would write up in a journal paper and say these are the results. But of course, before that comes all of the qualitative data, all of the reasoning and so on. And so a few different people and various different research teams have tried to grapple with the qualitative data as well, and what can we learn from how these things get reasoned out, what gains prominence, what arguments get shoved aside. A lot of people are also interested in the quality of deliberation. What are the elements that you'd require for good reasoned dialogue, and so on. So, of course, there have been lots of different results, and especially also across different jurisdictions. I'm just going to give a very quick snapshot of a few. So these are the top-level results of the 2007 deliberation, where participants overall collectively gave strong support for biobanks and research. Now, at the time, now this is not so surprising anymore, but at the time this was a big deal. And so we didn't want to assume at any stage that biobanks were okay. So in many ways, that first deliberation was held at a higher level rather than a more detailed nitty-gritty, how do we do the policy thing, because we did not want to brush over that and say, okay, well, it's a done deal, how do we do it? But this came up quite strongly and consistently. And given this support for biobanks, in fact, those participants said, and not only that, we want you to be really practical and efficient with those biobanks. If all of these resources are going to go into them, you might as well do it well, so make sure you do it properly. The primary concerns that were raised were over unethical use of the biobank. So there was no concern with the health research, but there were questions about like, what if other people use it? And a particular trope that came out a lot was of the mad scientist that might go. And there's interesting sort of qualitative analysis about like what meaning does that hold, and what are the consequences of using that rhetorically. I've just got one quote here from that, and this is the paper where that quote was used. So here the participants are talking about how do you construct trustworthy oversight, how do you construct governance, and she says, let the lawyer and doctor grasp the whatchamacallits. The parent or the layperson isn't going to fully understand all that other stuff. But the lawyer isn't going to understand all the medical side, and the medical guy isn't going to understand how the lawyer relates to it. So each of those persons has their own opinions. I won't understand all the medical, but I might understand the ethics of it, how it would affect the community. And I think this is it's very obvious, right? But it's surprisingly an insight that the experts haven't gotten to yet, because we still see a lot of biobanks governed strictly only under scientists' oversight, with, yes, research ethics protocols, but actually run by scientists. And that's, of course, good for the science, but if we think about these as public goods that may or may not be used in other ways down the line, what the participants say makes sense. You want some more diversified governance structure. Here's a takeout from the 2009 results. So the 2009 deliberation was a lot more specific on issues compared to the 2007 one. And here was one of the surprising surprising findings we didn't expect. The question was, should consent be required for all samples? So, for example, if we're thinking about pathology collections here, they've existed for 20 years. You might not be able to contact those people again. Can you use them for research? And if you do you need consent? So the participants said, yes. So this was at the end of deliberation. They then had a vote, and they said 23 said yes. You have to have consent if they're identified. Makes sense, right? Like your name's on it. You can't just use that. You have to check with the person. Then when it was de-identified, so the idea here is that there's a linking code, so you can bring them back together again, but it's not immediately obvious. It was almost the same. So 21 people said, yes, you have to have consent. But the surprise came here with the anonymous samples. And so we only had those three categories. In the question that we gave, it said, identified, de-identified, anonymous. But the participants came back and said, well, what do you mean anonymous? And we said, well, anonymous, you can't check. They said, well, it depends. Are you talking about archived samples, like in the pathology lab, or are you talking about collective, prospective collections that you're collecting now? So they said, well, if they're archived, if they're really anonymous, most of them said, no, you don't have to have consent. go ahead and use it. But if you're collecting today, you know that you're going to be doing research on it, you have no excuse not to ask for consent. So of course you have to ask us for consent. Well, on balance, right? Okay, so conclusions. So the argument essentially is that we need norms, collective societal norms to guide these decisions about biobanks, and this is relevant in many areas of health. So public deliberation is something we've experimented with in regards to developing some of these kind of norms, and I certainly don't think deliberation is the be-all and end-all. I don't think this solves all the problems, but I do think it is one important avenue that we can involve publics in meaningful ways in these kind of decisions. But using deliberation in this way has its own challenges, and one that I'll just sort of leave you with to leave something hanging in the minds as a problem. With all of this linking going on, how do we think of involving local publics meaningfully? So we were able to do it on a provincial level or on a state level in the US. But what do you then do if you have a governance structure that takes that into account, and you then have to link across provinces and so on? So these are still challenges that we really don't know how to manage, even with some of these sort of deliberative models. So there's many people to acknowledge here. I'll leave that up to finish with. Thank you.
We're using a mic for questions just because it's not because we can't hear you. So, questions. I'm sure there will be many. There's just so many interesting issues.
It's not, well, actually, I'd like a little bit more comment on the issue of trust and trustworthiness. I mean, I sort of wonder, well, how does an organization make itself more trustworthy? And we're a very risk-averse culture anyway now. We don't really like that. And we are less and less trusting of large organizations. So I'm just wondering if you have a little bit more to say on what participants had to say. I mean, I liked the idea, sort of a more diversified governance. That makes sense, but I'm not sure exactly why the participants feel that would be better. They just don't want to trust one particular group of people, that maybe scientists are especially untrustworthy?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. So I think, they emphasize this diversity in governance, right? And I think, maybe that's even a consequence of us emphasizing the different stakeholder groups from the outset, right? So the fact that there are ethical value trade-offs, and depending on where you're coming from, you're going to do this differently. Like a privacy advocate is going to see this totally differently from a health researcher, right? So part of it, I think, is that recognition, and that we want all of these things present in the governance. But in terms of the whole trust and trustworthiness, we've been thinking a lot about that, and often, especially in the psychological literature, I hate to say, trust is seen as it's something measurable in the individual. You either have more or less trust. That's how psychologists deal with it. Yeah, very problematic, I know. So therefore, if you want more trust, you do something that makes people trust more, right? So it's manufacturing trust. So what we're talking about here is well, of course, there has to be that element of people feel this trust, but we also want to construct some kind of governance structure that we can sort of objectively, normatively say that is trustworthy. You should trust this, rather than just, people do actually trust it because it's been manufactured. How do you do that? In general, we've been arguing for more participation on this. And in terms of like the other sort of strand of this work, which is on how do you actually construct that governance, we've sort of been advocating for models that actually involve participant organizations. So that for example, you automatically by donating to a biobank, you become a member of this participant association, which gives you a right to vote for an elected kind of sub board or something that sits in the governance structure. So that's one example. Genetic Alliance in the US is trying to work. They're building several biobanks. They're trying also. They're experimenting with sort of electronic, individualized enrollment platforms, working towards that. So there's a few models, but I think it's an open question at the moment.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So my question is more of a sort of a wonder. inquisitive comment, maybe. And it has to do with the quote that you showed. I think it was the participant commenting on the process. And I found it really interesting that there were sort of, I think, 3 positions identified. The position of the scientist, which we should leave to the scientists because they study these things, they know these things. And the lawyer, well, they study law, and so they should be the ones sort of giving the perspective of the legal perspective. And then there's the ethics perspective, which is sort of, in that quote, is sort of left to the people, just because as people, we have the ethical insight. And maybe this is sort of selfish in a way, but as someone who works on ethical theory, I'm just wondering if that is true, if that is correct, that we just sort of have this ethical insight built into us, and that we don't really need to bring a more rigorous perspective on the matter. I mean, in a way, one could argue that what happens in ethical deliberations that are maybe not guided by theory is the reinstatement of the status quo, the reproduction of the ideas that are present in the society, and the sort of the perspective of what should be gets replaced with the perspective of what is. And maybe that would be problematic for things like justice across generations. We would, our ethical deliberations sort of at the surface level might be guided by self-interest or by the contingencies that we have now, but not really take into account how it would affect people in different circumstances, etc. So I was just wondering if, if there's any talk or any consideration of providing some sort of an ethical theory perspective as part of the informative process or the preliminary process.
Yeah. So when you say an ethical theory perspective, you're talking about, like a formal philosophical ethical analysis?
Sort of. I mean, I remember coming to my first year ethics course and realizing that all these really sort of grounded ethical or moral knowledge that I had were sort of inherently contradicting or incoherent, or that they were sort of taken as assumptions. But once I started to question, why do I believe this, they sort of crumble. So yeah, I mean, maybe something like if you take a sort of consequentialist approach to this, what are the consequences of your approach? Not just in the beginning of your deliberation, but also in the end.
So usually one of the expert speakers at the beginning is an ethicist.
Okay.
So we do have. So certainly that feeds into it. Now, when we do the preparation of the background booklets and all that sort of stuff, that also, I mean, most of the literature comes out of research ethics. Mm. So there is formal, but if you look at a lot of the bioethics literature, not all, but a lot of it, certainly when it comes to biobanks, actually very little of it is along those lines of formal ethical analysis. It's usually more applied ethics. So there's actually not that much there anyway. Now, is there benefit to that or not? I think that's an interesting question to ask. On the question of, do you simply produce the status quo, like people just talk to their own self-interest? That, I think, there's 2 answers to that question. One is the norms of what deliberation is supposed to be, ideally, is that it's supposed to transcend. It's supposed to be a process in which people come to transcend their individual opinions, in theory. Mm. The second part, I think, is that it's an empirical question whether people actually do or not. So I think what you say is certainly, I think, an important concern, and I think this is the difference between those of us who work on deliberation in health versus deliberative democrats, where I think deliberative democrats are advocates for deliberative democracy, whereas we see this as a possibly useful tool in complex governance arrangements. So I would say that those people I worked with, we would certainly be concerned about these questions, and we would see them as empirical questions.
Mm. Thank you.
question is public versus private or commercial ownership of biobanks. How, in your observation and research observations on and research about biobanks, how does that change the ethical thrust or direction of biobanking governance and policy?
Yeah, I think that's a really good and really difficult question. I think partly it depends on. It actually depends on the country in which you're doing it. And it also depends on what kind of commercial or private involvement you're talking about. So Mayo Clinic, for example, is private, but their biobanks look very similar in a way to sort of large national biobanks we might have here. And then you also have more recently a bunch of like various different insurance providers. Kaiser Permanente is got a biobank they're constructing. So how does that look ethically different? Well, okay, let me do a cop out. When we ask participants what they think about it, they're very concerned about the commercial involvement in general. But ironically, especially in Canada, but ironically, when we spoke to the Mayo Biobank participants, they were not at all worried about Mayo Biobank having private ownership of this. They were very worried about the government coming in and taking control of it. Yeah, very American. So I know this is not an answer to the ethical conundrum, but it's maybe an indication to what some of the concerns are. What I find interesting is more commercial involvement that is not health research related. Because when it's health research related, the mandate is fairly clear, and even though I said the ethics protocols don't work and so on, we still have ethics protocols, and we have, I think, we have a community of researchers that are very sensitized to this. But if you now look at things like direct-to-consumer genetic testing, where the primary purpose is not health research but service provision, so people are entering into contracts for I will pay you money and you will give me this service, and it's almost incidental that in that transaction I'm giving you my genetic material. So there's not a lot of whereas in the research ethics transaction, whether private or commercial, it's very explicit. I'm giving you my genetic material and you agree to protect it in these particular ways, whereas that's not going on with the direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies. And that, I think, introduces, to me, more concerning ethical questions. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so before I forget, when we talk this afternoon,
Yeah.
One idea I had in mind when I was thinking about biobanks was that, and I don't know enough to know whether this is ever possible or ever done, but if you had identifiers with each sample, but researchers weren't allowed access to the identifiers, and then if some new discovery occurs, say a new gene for colon cancer susceptibility, and the biobank finds out that I've got that gene, I might actually want that information, and I'll stop putting off getting that colonoscopy. So did you address any of those sorts of issues where people might actually want feedback? I mean, I know people often don't want feedback about their genetic predisposition to diseases, but for some diseases, they might. And I was just wondering if you ever addressed that question.
Yeah. We that definitely comes up that comes up in pretty much every one of the deliberations. Now, ideally, when you have these deliberations, you want to be integrative in terms of the knowledge. I know from the most recent California deliberations, I was talking to the facilitator, and they mentioned that they had a problem around this specific issue, because she said that they talked separately about the privacy issues and then about these incidental finding issues, and they said when it came to privacy, they said no, absolutely it has to be anonymized, and then the incidental findings discussion, they said no, absolutely we have to feedback the findings, and of course the two are mutually exclusive, right? You have to have one or the other. In general, I think people vary. We have people who say they don't want to know, and we have people saying that they do want to know, and the challenge is how do you build that into the governance structure. I think this is actually an example where I didn't talk about this much, but the individualized sort of dynamic consent models, which work along these electronic platforms where individuals can manage and personalize all of their preferences and consent things. So J&K in the UK is working a lot with those, and some of the folks at University of Washington are building those models as well. They would allow you to do that in a somewhat more dynamic way. So there is movement on this, and I think people are getting somewhere with this. But the problem is still, I think a big problem that's not been addressed very well yet is that if you have, in those instances where you have research and care totally separate, you don't have the clinical safeguards in terms of the testing. You don't have the clinical validity, analytical validity, all that sort of stuff built in, which you would have in the clinical test. And sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes the research tests are more sensitive, the genomic tests are more sensitive than whatever other tests they use in the clinic. And what kind of research burden does that, so what extra burden does it put on the researchers to have to then do that? How do they even do that? So that there's uncertainty around that.
Hello. That was a nice talk. So my question is a variation on what Gerardo just asked. And really what I'm interested in is how you think about this, or if you find there's any place to take this observation into account whatsoever. So it goes something like this. So from a perspective of an expert in ethics, from someone who studied, let's say, 30 years of ethical theory. So I think of that in exactly the way that Gerardo said, is that a specialist, orthopedic surgeon, has a level of expertise indexed to his or her schooling and publishes papers. And the same thing is true of a legal theorist. And I think of ethical theorists this way as well. Although the kinds of quotations that you show, and even this approach of including the publics and then seeing that the publics have something to contribute around ethics and values, that gives them a kind of, that there's a kind of credential there that isn't presupposed to be equivalent to the information or the wisdom they have about their bodies or about law. So the first thing I would think is that might be wrong, is that the publics, whatever that is, have some wisdom about law, some wisdom about medicine and bodiliness, and some wisdom about values. I don't at all think that there's an automatic default that says because people are people, they somehow know something more about ethics. So that's the first thing that concerns me, is that sort of presumption, because it might be false. And then if it's false, then it could be pernicious to take it to be the case that that's how you divvy up the expertise. And I'm also on a research ethics board, and I've worked with scientists as an ethicist. So I see this presumption at work a lot, and I've been trying to think about how to bring in and make instructive and productive the kinds of things that Gerardo was speaking about. As you come in first-year ethics, and you soon realize that the kinds of things, the values you hold or the things that you take to be true, turn out to be often contradictory, or they come out of radically different frameworks that can't actually be squared. Or even more so, that you might hold dear a set of principles or values that have a normative dimension, but turn out to be, this is sort of unflattering, but like a kind of version of the junk food of ethics, like the really easiest thing to think through, which is usually a kind of utilitarian consequentialist perspective. So it's not that it's necessarily wrong, it's this sort of the easiest thing to think about. And when I work with the research ethics boards, I sometimes get frustrated because I think these principles of privacy, risk, harm, protection, they're actually all coming out of a slightly utilitarian consequentialist perspective. So again, it's not that they're wrong, it's that they're really reductivist of the sophistication of the field that's there. And so there are other values and ways of thinking. I know that that's a big question it's the kind of work I'm doing, is how could even something like virtue or virtue ethics, or that entire perspective, which is enormously wonderful, find its way in any way into the character of research ethics boards thinking about what ethics is or looks like. So sometimes I think even a small adjustment in the wording, so what you call ethics should be called something like sub-ethics or a section of ethics, just to keep alive the truth that what is often called ethics, equivocated with ethics, is not the whole of ethics. It's a small subdomain, and it's often the easiest subdomain. So it's really a question, but so when you say you have an ethics expert who comes in and speaks, it still doesn't, like, I'd like to know more about what he or she does, what's presumed to be too complicated for people to understand. Is it at the same kind of level of diversity of information that you get from a medical expert or from a legal expert? Who's in charge of thinking through whether the presentation is sophisticated enough or whether it's playing already to this junk food lowest common denominator that people can handle and the public feels like they know something about. It's really interesting about power too, right? You have a group of people who then they're looking to have something to contribute, and you think, well, what if it's set up so that they feel as though they can contribute in this way and leave this to those individuals? But anyway, there's not really a question there, but how do you think about bringing in the richness and diversity of ethical theory in its broadest sense into these conversations?
So, okay, so maybe a bit of explanation. I'm not an ethicist. But Mike Burgess, who's my collaborator who started this program, is an ethicist. And he had a number of observations. So I'll start off with his observations and then add my own. So his observations were that whenever he was faced with kind of conversations around the REB table or similar kind of forums, that he found that very often he was put into a position where he had to stand in as proxy to voice what his best take was on a certain community's perspective on this, or a certain type of person's perspective on the particular kind of ethical issue. So what his concern was that, yes, you have all the ethical theory and so on, but what's missing around the table is these different community perspectives, and these are not being heard. And he felt that he was a poor substitute for having those voices actually be a part of this conversation. So this was to him a large motivator for looking for ways that this might be done. And so deliberation was one possibility, and it's among a bunch of different ones that we've sort of played with. This seems to have been the one that actually provides the most substance. Now, so because the question is, if you come from a position where you say, like, I don't think the broader public has anything to say here, then that's a position one can maintain and say, well, this is all nonsense and we don't want to do that, right? So if that's your position, then I've got to change my response. But I sense that you do see some value in this. So if we say, yes, we see some value in this, then the question is, how do we do that? And we actually don't have very many options of how to do that. And this is why I sort of started off with the preamble of, okay, well, what about a survey? What about a focus group? Well, these things fail very badly on all of the criteria you mentioned. So deliberation, in a way, is the best out of those kind of options. Does it achieve all of those other things? I don't know. And I think that's part of the ongoing evaluation to ask those kind of things. In terms of like who are the people who are labeled as ethicists, they've typically been senior members of the Canadian bioethics community. Daryl Pulwin spoke at the first one. Obviously in the US they've had other people, but they're usually senior members recognized in the bioethics community as having both the experience and the training in these sorts of areas. But I just want to add one other thing, and I think that, yes, I think ethical theory and so on does probably have a role in many of these things, but I don't think, I would not say that ethical theory should have priority to a whole bunch of other considerations. And there's only so much you can throw into the mix. And I see this actually not so much as an ethical problem as a political one. Because we do have different interests at play, different societal interests. Some of them are associated with particular identifiable groups. Some are not. Some are diffuse. And so I see ethicists as having a role in this, but by no means the role of an arbiter, in my opinion.
Just to follow up on that, I think that that's a really nice way of parsing it out. From the perspective of somebody who's trying to represent different groups, this might be the best process at hand to get at some of that diversity of values from representatives. So as a political solution, this looks like it gets at allowing a diversity of values to be expressed through individuals rather than just one individual. And I guess I'm just saying that the same kind of thing can happen from the side of theory, that there's a diversity there that that could be represented through some kind of different procedural approach rather than just having one individual speak on behalf of all of those theories too.
I hear you, but I would get exactly the same position from a biobanker, and he would say, oh my God, you have one person speaking for all biobankers, you haven't got somebody from the population biobank, you haven't got somebody from, I mean, what you're saying to me is what the lawyer would say as well. It's like, you have one lawyer speaking for all lawyers? I mean, that's crazy, right? I mean, these are practical constraints, I think.
They're practical constraints, but I would still wonder, I mean, then the question is about what the diversity is that's being
represented.
What the presumed homogeneity diversity is to begin with, from which then you're making choices, practical choices about who should be there and who shouldn't be there. And so I'm sure everything you're saying is exactly right. But as an ethicist who's really aware of a real diversity, a real heterogeneity of perspectives, that can't just be represented through one voice, let alone through a sequence of 4 or 5 principles, then I ask a question about diversity from the perspective that way. And I wonder if it's...
But how would you do it?
I don't know. I have to think about it. I've been trying to think about it as well. But at a basic level, pushing at all of our assumptions of exactly the same kind that Gerardo brought up, that the presumption that what people know is ethics and they know that better, more robustly than they know medicine or law. I think that that's not a bad place to at least trouble our base assumptions, because otherwise we'll think we've got that looked after.
I just want to say one thing, one more thing in response. So I don't think that this is the be-all and end-all, by no stretch of the imagination. So I don't want to defend this model as for what it's not supposed to be defended as. But very early on in the process, before this had been ever done before, we approached. So I didn't talk a lot about this in recruitment, but we do have minimum filters for certain key groups that we felt that if we relied just on a random recruitment, they wouldn't be part of it. And so these were mainly disabilities and genetic disabilities, so that there was some kind of sort of representation of experience with the healthcare system, and another one was First Nations because of some of the nutritional health issues. So when we then approached some of the First Nations groups, or one representative in particular, saying, how do we best do this? How do we respectfully approach the First Nations in terms of doing this and so on? His response was, you shouldn't be doing this, we should be doing this. And so the response then was, well, but you won't. So I respect your position, and this all sounds wonderful, but you won't do this, so we will, and we'll just do the best we can in terms of trying to bring those voices into the mix. And it comes back to, again, I know you don't like the response that it's a practical answer, but I don't see a way around that. Because if we had those standards of representing the diversity of ethical values, we'd have to take some other information out. Or we'd have to just not do it at all. And so the question then is it better to not do it? And that's an option.
But there's another question. So I think what you're doing is excellent, but I also think making transparent those choices, not just at the level of the kinds of groups that you represent, but the kinds of choices for what gets left out and how those are unavoidable trade-offs. But it's about being conscious of the kinds of things that are left behind and making your readers and your audience aware that there were choices at that level just as much as there were at the level of demographics.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, just hearing the exchange, also one maybe misunderstanding between the two of you that might be happening is I think that Kieran is assuming that, or seems to think that much of the discussion in the deliberation comes down to an exchange of ethical views, but of course deliberative democracy conceives of the members to the deliberation as stakeholders with different perspectives and interests as well as values. So they're sharing their perspectives and and they're also motivated by different interests, but they are first and foremost stakeholders. So in that sense, it's not that they're positioned as ethical experts, but that their interests and positions and perspectives as stakeholders is valued within a deliberative democratic framework in ways that it's not in other political models. So that so it may not be demoting ethics or putting it on a pedestal, but their normative perspectives are just one of many things that are under discussion, I think. Anyway, do you have any last comments for us before we wrap up?